control is what the person or the personality is interested in, because if the reality that the person perceives to be true and real is the case, then having control makes sense, right? If it is the case that you are your body, having control makes sense. If it is the case that you are separate from all of other human beings, then having control makes sense. If it is the case that you're separate from the world, and therefore the world, what's happening in the world is unpredictable, then it's understandable that you're going to be invested in having control. The problem is, if that's not true, then it's not going to be of much use. So, these teachings are about allowing us to understand that it's not necessary to have control. But you can't experience that unless your understandings of the teachings are deep enough to understand that. And you can't experience that unless you're far enough along in the practices to have a clear experience of that being the case. Meaning that you have enough of experience of your true nature so that there is a foundation there. There's a ground of being that you can stand on, somewhere where there's consistency, somewhere where there's a reality that's not changing all the time. One of the issues with being a person, one of the reasons that people typically feel anxious is because in an attempt to experience some kind of consistency and some kind of consistency in the experience of yourself that allows you to be able to relax, rather than living in a thought process that's changing all the time, and you may consider yourself or be considered to be a consistent personality, right? But the reality of it is there are many I's, there are many personalities that play out in the course of a day. When you're at work, you're being the employee. When you're at home, you're being the father or the partner or the husband. You're always in roles that are constantly changing. And so one of the things that is part of this practice is to start to have somewhere where you can put your attention that's not changing. So you can start to relax and you can start to settle down, and you don't have to be so paranoid and so constantly upset, constantly disturbed by your attempts to have things be consistent, or your attempt to have some solid sense of yourself. So, recently I've been, many years ago I had learned about George Gurdjieff, and recently there's a new book out on Gurdjieff's teachings and in this book they actually have some of the exercises that he used to teach people. George Gurdjieff was a mystic, but he wasn't an Eastern person. He was born in Armenia, and he was a businessman, and he developed this teaching that they say is based on maybe Sufi teachings or Eastern teachings, but he developed a teaching in which he was teaching from a Western perspective. And so one of the things that he taught was that, as I have said here, and as all the teachings say, the first thing you have to do is recognize who you are, right? You got to have some sense of yourself as awareness itself, and then from there you can start to do what Gurdjieff called the work, right? And the work involves a commitment, it involves a willingness on your part to dedicate attention and energy to this work on a consistent basis, and to do the work in your everyday life is consistent with the way Gurdjieff's teaching went. And one of the things that he said is that, he called the awareness the essence. He said that he called the awareness the essence. So there's the essence and the personality. It's the same as when we say the awareness and the personality, right? Saying the same thing. Right? And one of the things that Gurdjieff said is that if you start to observe your thoughts and your movements, your physical movements, your gestures, and your patterns, you'll start to see the automaticity. You'll start to see how mechanical it all is. For example, and one of the things he did to work with people is he would observe their repetitive patterns of behavior and point it out, right? So, for example, there was a student that one of Gurdjieff's teachers was working with, and was a new student, right? And so what the teacher said to the student, the teacher noticed the student kept touching his face. If you look in your life, you'll see there are things you do. There are little habits that you have, right? That you keep repeating over and over and over again, right? And one of the things that Gurdjieff said is if you pay attention, you'll start to notice some of these habits. If you work with people that can observe you, they can point these habits out to you. And one of the things he said to this particular student who touched his face a lot, stop touching your face. See if you can practice not touching your face, right? And so what the student said was that, okay, so now he had to pay attention to that, right? He had to be more mindful of that. He had to be more aware of his gestures, of his physical movements, right? So that's a way of talking about waking up, starting to see something you weren't seeing before, paying attention to what you weren't paying attention to before, right? So the student reported that while he was in the presence of the teacher, he was very conscious of whether he touched his face, and he didn't touch his face, right? But not that long after this, he was walking away and talking to somebody else, and he touched his face. And then he realized that the teacher saw him do it, right? And that he couldn't help going back to the pattern, right? This is a very important thing because you're learning to do a couple of things. You're learning to be a witness, right? Paying attention, witnessing your gestures, your physical movements, right? And this is an important part of the process of what we're talking about here is you have to learn to start self-observation. You have to start paying attention to what you're doing that's mechanical, what you're saying that's mechanical. Do you ever notice, this is another one that's pretty obvious. Do you ever notice if you listen to other people around you speaking that they have a habitual way of speaking? A habitual way of speaking? And that you have a habitual way, so you use certain words a lot, right? You have habitual ways of being, habitual patterns and so forth, right? And what Gurdjieff said is that it's very important to learn to pay attention this way so you could start to see yourself more objectively. Instead of being you, right? Instead of being the personality, you can start to see the personality from a more objective viewpoint, right? To see what you're doing, right? So this is just one of the many ways that he worked. And one of the things that he said is after you have a sense of yourself, after you have recognized your essence, the way he would say your essence, I would say after you've recognized your awareness, right? That you want to start to give that attention on a regular basis, right? Because it didn't exist before you recognized it, right? The awareness was something that most people are not paying attention to. They're ignoring it, right? So when you do see it, and you do recognize this is your essence, this is your Buddha nature, this is your true nature, right? Then the game is on, right? The game is on in terms of, can you then keep remembering who you are? Can you keep coming back and touching that? Can you keep coming back and recognizing that as you go through your day? So one of the things that Gurdjieff came up with is he called it self-remembering. And one of the things he did is he taught the students in the morning to prepare for the day. It was actually preparation exercises, right? To kind of kind of set yourself up for the day in the morning. And one of the things that he recommended is that in this preparation that you 3 or 4 times a day make a note in your mind to remember yourself. So in the morning, for example, you might say at 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 3 o'clock, I'm going to remember myself. Right? So this is a way of starting to actively come out of being asleep, right? Actively come out of being in lost up in your being a person, lost up in your being in your habits and your mechanicalness, right? Because one of the things he pointed out is that human beings, until they recognize their true nature, are total machines, totally mechanical. Everything is automatic. Push a button, behavior, right? Stimulus response, like Skinner said, right? So one of the students that was practicing this was a lawyer, right? Maybe I'll send you a clip of this lawyer because he's the one who wrote the newest book on Gurdjieff. And it would be interesting for you to, and maybe I'll talk about some of the exercises in the book because I have the book, right? Maybe we can play with some of those things so you can use them, right? But in his case, he was practicing self-remembering and he was a lawyer. And so in the morning he said, you know, at this particular time, I'm going to remember myself, right? Well, first of all, you got to remember yourself. For a lot of people, that'll be the first challenge, just to remember yourself, right? But he had been doing the work for a while, so he could remember himself. And when that time came, he was in a meeting with a business meeting with other people, right? So now he had to remember himself without anybody noticing he was doing anything, right? He had to do something. So now it's kind of like juggling, right? He had to be there in the meeting, interacting, right? Being present, hearing what people were saying, right? And at the very same time, have attention on who he actually was, remembering himself, being aware of himself as awareness, right? This is a very important thing, you know, that you can train yourself to practice remembering yourself. I have a guy that I'm working with, and he did some kind of course or training with somebody, and they did a thing where they set their smartwatch, they set alarms, you know, 3 or 4 alarms during the day. And every time the alarm would go off, they would stop whatever they were doing and remember themselves. Pay attention to the awareness that's there, right? Because the awareness is there at all times, right? And so if we've been living our lives as the personality, right? And we want to have that personality and the awareness integrate, right? So that the awareness is expressing itself through the personality, and the personality is no longer operating from a fear-based operation or paranoia or all the neurotic aspects of the person, right? And so to have this happen, there has to be an active process in which you keep using things to make contact with the reality of who you are. One of the things I've said here that works to do that is train yourself to pay attention to when you're upset, right? Well, that's a good time to remember who you are, isn't it, right? Yeah, because that's when you get into trouble, right? That's when you do things that hurt other people. That's when you do things that hurt yourself, right? So to pay attention when you're upset, and when upset starts, if you can hone in on that, like really focus on it very closely and make contact with the reality of yourself at that time, right? That can be a breakthrough. You can be in the middle, and I've had this experience, so I know it's true. You can be in the middle of the worst way that you are in terms of when you're upset and you're enraged, right? And you say and do the things you do when you're upset and you're enraged. You can be in the worst moment of that, right? And because you've been working on training yourself to remember yourself, right, to wake up, you can be in the worst moment of that. In the middle of it, wake up. In the middle of it, wake up and see the person and see the thinking of the person and see the feelings of the person and see the compulsive behavior that's arising for the person, right? And if you wake up in the middle of that, it can be a huge breakthrough in terms of in the middle of being enraged and behaving, you know, the way you behave when you're like that. In the middle of it, it can just stop. It can just stop. That's a very powerful experience if you can have an experience like that, right? So these practices can be very useful, And you really need to have some way to work with this process of remaining awake. You really need to have some way to work with this process of having the experience of who you are as awareness itself start to come forward, right? Because prior to the recognition of yourself, the personality is in front of it all the time. Thinking is in front of it all the time, right? So the work and the process is to bring the essence, he would say the essence, or the awareness forward, so that becomes in front of the personality instead of behind the personality. That most people would at least say that, some people would say they have control over everything. Well, right. That's obviously not the case. But most people would at least say I have control over what I think, and I have control over my movements, what I do, right? I have control over what I do. I have control over my body, right? And so what Rupa was saying is that's not true. Those things aren't true, and you have to come to see that in order to understand the implications of not doing this work, right? And he said if you did have control over your thoughts, right, then you would not have a thought that was disturbing or upsetting. You would not have a thought that was disturbing or upsetting. And what he was saying is if that was the case, if you could control your thoughts, right, and your wife left you, right, the thought you would have if you control your thoughts is, oh, that's fine, good luck with that, right? But see, here's the thing. It's one thing to deal with these things that way and understand your relationship to thinking, right? But first, in order for you to do that, in order for that to be the case, right, you have to first have established yourself as the authentic self. You have to know who you are to do that. So he's not being a person when he says that to his wife. No, he's aware of his essence, as Gurdjieff would say, or he's aware of his true self, or his Buddha nature, or his, whatever you want to call it, right? And it is the case that essence or that awareness would have that response. That when you discover your true nature and you start to give it some attention and you start to see that its nature, right? This is what he was pointing to. When you discover your true nature and you start to pay attention to that, and you discover its nature is that it doesn't have a problem with anything. It just is. Awareness is just here. It doesn't have a problem with anything, right? That's what's behind that, right? Yeah, and from that experience, right, it actually can be the case that what's happening in terms of, even if the thoughts were upsetting and disturbing, right, from the experience of your true nature, that wouldn't be a problem. You would relate to the thought the same way he was talking about relating to the situation, right? The relating to the situation, if you're experiencing from your true nature, would be if your wife left you for your best friend. Oh, okay, good. Have a good life. Thank you. Right? Let me tell you something. I'm sure for a lot of people, what I'm saying here, and if they were to watch that video, they would say, "Oh, no." And he gave that example on purpose. It's something that almost everybody would be freaked out about, right? To demonstrate that even that, because ultimately, if you realize yourself and you experience yourself as the Buddha nature, as the true nature, as the awareness, even death is not a disturbance, right? So this is what it keeps coming back to. I want you to know that it's not like you could misunderstand what he's saying to think, oh, I'm practicing being enlightened, so if my wife leaves me, the way I practice being enlightened is to not care about it. No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying if you do the work, you really won't care about it. And one of the ways you can work with these kinds of things is to intentionally put yourself into situations that are going to stimulate fear, that are going to stimulate a lot of disturbance emotionally, or a lot of disturbance in terms of your physical well-being, whatever the case may be. a few years back, I went to Moscow to do some teaching, right? And I was going alone, right, to a place on the other side of the planet, right, where I didn't speak the language, right, where I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know who these students were going to be. They were graduate students in a graduate school for psychology in Moscow, right? So, it was interesting because when I started I was talking to a person that was assisting me in getting the visa and all that jazz, right? And I was being hesitant with her about it. Well, what about this? And are the people that are sponsoring me, are they going to handle X, Y, and Z? And blah, blah. And at one point she said to me, "Are you sure you're not afraid to go?" And when she said that, I stopped and looked, and I saw, yeah, there was fear about this, right? There was fear. I'm going to be alone over there. It's the other side of the world. I don't speak the language. I don't even know the people I'm going to stay with, right? So I saw that, but after I saw it, and see, this is how it starts to go if you take this stuff seriously, right? Because at that point I was already absolutely committed to self-realization, to being who I really am, right? So when I saw that fear, I said, fear. Now I want to go because I want to deal with whatever it is that fear is about, right? And so I went and to the airport and I had to take a flight to JFK and then I was taking a Russian airline because the people that sponsored me bought the ticket, so it was a Russian airline. And when I got to JFK, I'm trying to find where this airline was, and I don't know if you've ever been to JFK, but they have different terminals, you have to take a train to one of the other terminals if you're taking a certain flight, right? So I'm rushing around and trying to figure out which way to go and everything. Finally, I think I know where I'm going. I take this bus to the other side of the airport, right? And I get to the plane just before they're shutting the door, right? So then I get to Moscow. I had no luggage, right? And so, and it goes on from there. I mean, it was one thing after another, right? That's the way life goes, right? But the thing about it that was very powerful for me is as these things happen, one thing at a time, right? I had enough presence to recognize that it was challenging my sense of security. It was challenging my sense of certainty, that I didn't know what was going to happen. Now what, right? Now what? No clothes. And I didn't get my luggage for 4 days, right? So I was there with just what I had on for 4 days, right? I mean, I could tell you story after story about what happened in Moscow, right? But the thing about it was, and then one day, this woman who was kind of my connection to the sponsors that brought me there, she arrived in Moscow, so she was with me, so I had at least somebody with me that spoke Russian, right? And so it was a very interesting experience. And at one point, she wanted to take me to dinner at some restaurant near Red Square, right? So, and this is the other thing. I was staying with these people at their house, a beautiful house, nice people, but they didn't speak English, right? So that was interesting. But and they had an apartment. Their house was in the suburbs of Moscow, right? But they also had an apartment in the center of Moscow, right? So after being there about 3 days, I told them, could I stay at the apartment alone instead of staying with you, right? Well, by this time, they already thought I was nuts anyway, right? For a lot of different reasons, right? So they went along with that and gave me the keys, and I went to the apartment, and I was staying by myself in Moscow in their apartment, right? So it was a very interesting experience. And then from there, I went to dinner with this person in Red Square at some restaurant, right? So we go to the restaurant in Red Square, and I had to take a subway from where the apartment was to Red Square, right? But the person was with me, showing me which way to do it, right? So we get to Red Square, we have dinner at this restaurant, and she had a Russian military commander join us. And so I don't know what they're talking about at the table, right? So at one point I asked her, what is he saying, and I don't know what she told him, but she said, he said, can I read his mind? So then I'm thinking, what the hell are you telling this guy, right? So we get done dinner and we walk outside the restaurant and she says, oh, I have to go to another meeting. I'll see you later. You'll find your way back. So that was another point, you know, where I had this flash of fear, like, what? What do you mean? Right? But then after that, I thought the next thing that came in was, oh, this is interesting. This is interesting. What am I going to do now, right? And so, but the thing about, and the reason I'm sharing this is because I had done enough work on myself up until that time. I was not upset. I was not freaking out. I was seeing this like an interesting experience, right? And so I was looking at this and thinking about, okay, how do I hold this experience? How do I be here, right? How do I be here in a way that's going to work right now, right? And what I came up with is, oh, I got it. Here's how I'm going to be here. This is a game show. This is a game show, and the way the game show works is they drop you off somewhere in the world, right? And you have to get from there to another place, and it's a matter of beating the clock. How fast can you do that, right? So I'm thinking, okay, this is a game show, so how do I do this, right? And so I'm just looking at possibilities. Now you see, here's the deal. If it hadn't been for the work, or if it was like a regular person in that situation, you know, that hadn't done any work, right, they'd probably be so afraid, you know, so disturbed that they couldn't think straight. They couldn't see what the possibilities were in terms of how to deal with this, right?
Might not have even gone.
Probably wouldn't have even gone, is right, yeah. I mean, I invited my wife and she said, oh no, I'm not going there. And so what I came up with is, okay, I have my phone, and my phone's working, and my phone has a GPS. So I can look at the GPS and see where I am on the map on my phone, right? And then I could look at the map on my phone and see, I knew the name of the place where I had to get to, right? And see where that was, right? And then I could just start walking and watch on the phone where I'm going, right? And so I did that, and I got back to the subway station, which was right there in Red Square, right near. And I went down the subway station, and then there's trains going both directions, right? And so it was like, which train do I take, right? So I figured, well, I'll just get on one of the trains and watch, right? So I got on a train and watched, and I was going away from where I needed to go, right? Well, so I got off at the next station, got on the train going on the other way, right? And that took me to where I had to get off, and I found my way back to the apartment. As soon as I walked into the apartment, the phone was ringing. So I picked it up. It was the people that sponsored me, right? Where are you? Where are you? I said, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. But, you know, that's an example. And so what I'm saying to you is that if you're really interested in making progress in this work and really experiencing the value of the work, put yourself in a situation, intentionally put yourself in a situation where you know you're going to be uncomfortable. And you know you're not going to be in, you know, feel the way you do when you're in the surroundings that you're familiar with. You know, even if you go on vacation, any of you have gone on vacation, you ever notice if you go on vacation, you go to a place you've never been before and you're far away from home, right? You ever notice that what that feels like? Yeah, it starts to like, you know, shake your foundation a little bit, like, oh no, you know, you don't know what to do. So these are the ways that you can work on seeing your personality, you know, and these are the ways you can work on dealing with your personality in such a way where you can remember yourself. And when you remember yourself, you'll be able to calm down and relax, even in circumstances that are really challenging. Watch and see if you can watch how your personality is dealing with the situation. And see if in that situation you can recognize your true nature. See if you can recognize the awareness that you are. See, because when I was in that situation in Russia, that's what I kept going back to. That's what that was my touchstone, right? I kept going back to the experience of my awareness, and when I went back to that, there was calmness. There was calmness. It wasn't upsetting at all.